Okay, so for everything we've done so far, it always requires what's the first thing that has to happen in order for anything to occur, in order for anything to happen with the database. Well, the user has to do something, right? So far, everything that we've done so far that kind of initiates an action, either the browser opening a page or them submitting a form, basically, or you sending an AJAX call. What we don't have is things that happen just on a timed basis. So that's part of what we want to go over today, is how to set up things that happen on a schedule, where maybe they happen weekly or they happen daily or hourly or whatever that schedule needs to be. So that's one thing that we're going to look at today. And hooked into that is also looking deeper, using a different tool to send out the emails, because that's the most frequent thing we do on a schedule, is we say, well, let's send an email every week or every day with new content, or letting users know that, hey, this thing's happened on your account, all those kind of things. Now, SMTP client, we've used that so far. That does generally work, but it is a very old sort of protocol. It's kind of an old way to do it. In fact, so far as if you look at the documentation on SMTP client at this point, Microsoft doesn't even recommend you use that nowadays. They don't even recommend that you use that class anymore. So what we're going to look at is another tool called SendGrid to kind of replace that. With a lot of the kind of things that we need to do in working with email, modern tools and things like that, one of the big things that comes up is that oftentimes you're going to have a website that sends out thousands of emails. Well, there's some special rules when it comes down to emails that you can only send out so many at a time to be marked as spam. But also just a matter of, hey, you're sending out thousands of emails, that actually is enough to put some stress on your server. So oftentimes it's worth offloading that. So SendGrid's what we call kind of a bulk email provider. It gives you kind of an API where you can say, okay, I want to send this out to all these people, and it will. If you look at their homepage, you'll see this kind of example, because what they have and the way they built this is actually they've got a web API that they've exposed that you can get an account and you can use it to send out emails. The example that they're showing here is something called curl, which is one way to just send out HTTP requests. So you can kind of see how the API looks. They're sending it as a post request. They're sending it to this URL, API SendGrid version 3 mail send. That's the specific API endpoint, is that mail send endpoint. You can see that it requires some sort of API key that's in this authorization header. You see it sending it as JSON data. It's also declaring that as a header. And then here's the actual data that we're sending it. So for instance, we've got what email is it going to, what email is it coming from, the subject line, and the content, right? And you can also see in here specifically that it's got here it's got it in plain, but it'll actually deal with sending things as plain text versus sending things as HTML, and kind of helping you automatically do that switch, because some clients still take plain text, some clients prefer HTML. So there's a lot of things that this kind of gives us out of the box, but the biggest thing there is just taking a load off of doing most of the grunt work of sending emails and tossing it onto their servers instead of our servers having to handle that, or us having to build up all the infrastructure that really goes into sending out a lot of emails. Okay. Another big advantage of how they've got their system set up, they also have some visuals and UI tools that you can use that non-technical people can actually send out emails with. So they can get in there, kind of design an email and hit send, and it'll go out to everybody on your list. Whereas if you're building it yourself, obviously that's something that then you have to integrate and deal with all the gotchas with that. Not to say that you can't still do that, but there's a lot of benefit to having another company build that system for you. Okay. So that's what we're going to be looking at is SendGrid. So what I'd like you to do, that's what we're going to look at first. So what I'd like you to do is go ahead and create an account on SendGrid.com. You're going to go ahead and set that up. We'll need to confirm your email. Once you've got that, the next thing we'll want to do is actually go create an API key so that we can use it. Yeah, so you want to go to SendGrid.com, go ahead and create an account, and then confirm your email address.
So is that, do we have to, do we just put Rankin?
Yeah, you can just put Rankin under there. Yeah, so you go through Start for Free. You'll specifically want to pick email API plans if you haven't yet.
We just name the key anything, or is it like
So once you get in, let's see if I can find, there's the API keys. So what you name it doesn't really matter. You can call it whatever you want. But you want to go to this, it's under settings, API keys. You want to create one. The important thing when you create the key, you want to go to restricted access, so it doesn't have access to do everything. And you want to make sure that you check, you go down to mail send, and underneath there, you'll just click over here. That's the part you need to turn on, is that it's allowed to send mail. That's the only permission that the API key should have, should be able to do. Once you get in there. Yeah, that's it. Put developer as your role. That'll change what you see once you get logged in. So if you go over to settings, you're over settings, API keys, and you're saying create API key. Did you save a copy of that?
The PT, yeah.
Yeah, so make sure you save it to a text file. You've got it. I'm just waiting on Jeremy. Just make sure you fill in all the fields and do work primarily. Donation amounts just after it. That's it. I think that's what you missed.
Yeah, there's no,
There you go. So finish that up. Again, what the key is actually called doesn't really matter. It's just that you have the number. So you're in here. You want to go to settings? API keys. So you're going to create the new one. You're going to say restricted access. You're going to go down to mail send, expand that, and just pick the mail send permission. So click on it. And then you say save. And then you're just going to copy that and save it. Okay, so I think we all should have an API key at this point. Just to talk briefly about that, most web APIs have this kind of idea, this idea of an API key. And specifically what it's meant for is to kind of give you a secure sort of login token to use the API, right? To prove that you are who you say you are. Treat it as a password, but we use it instead of a username and password simply because if an API key is compromised, it's not as big of a deal. That makes sense? Because I can just regenerate a new key, and then anybody who got access to the previous key is out of it. That makes sense? So we can deactivate the keys and just say, okay, well, we'll run the application on a new key if for some reason there's a compromise to it. It also means that in that process, we're never giving out passwords to anybody, and they're randomly generated and they're long, right? They're not short 8-character passwords that somebody might be able to guess. They're long random things that are not easily guessable. So that's part of why we use that. Any questions there? Okay, so that you'll see with pretty much any API you want to use. You'll generally need to create an API key in order to use it. All right, so let's go back here. So there's a few steps that we need to go through in order to use SendGrid in our application, okay? So the first one is that we need to do is we need to create that API key, which we've done. The next step that we want to do is we actually put it into an environment variable, okay? We've already done that before, actually, if you remember right. When we used SMTP, I already showed you how to do an environment variable, set one up there. So we're going to do that same kind of sequence of steps, but we're going to call the environment variable SendGrid underscore API underscore key this time. So if you type in env, that's going to get you edit system environment variables. We need to go in there. 1 second while I change something on here. So you're going to go, once you get in here, you're going to click environment variables button down at the bottom. You want to create one up in the top section. This is your environment variable specifically for your user. So I'm going to say new. This is where I'm going to call this SendGrid API key. I'm going to call that as the name of the variable, and I'm going to put in my API key there.
So like if we were to deploy this, it wouldn't work if somebody didn't have this API key?
They're going to have a API key, right? So your code, because we're all using the same name, I'll actually be able to run your code, your website, but it would run against my API key. Does that make sense? Because I'll have a different API key in my environment variables. So this means you're also not hard coding that environment variable into your actual code. It's just going to be something that you have in your system. If we were going to deploy this to several different systems, let's say we were going to apply this to Azure or AWS, they have ways to set up the environment variables that you use. So you'd use their web interface to set these things up. But it's the same code as far as that's concerned. You don't have to change anything with the code.
It's kind of like PGP.
PGP?
PGP, yeah, where like you have a code, and then you only that person can have, or in order to, it's like a way to encrypt messages, basically. So like you have your public code.
Yeah, so it's not that algorithm specifically, because I think you're talking about specifically a private public key algorithm, which this isn't really. This is just, hey, we have this number, and therefore we're going to present this number when we go to talk to the server, and that's going to prove that we are who we say we are, and that we've gotten permissions. So for instance, you saw how we can change, we have permissions that we can say this key can do these things. And we can also change that later and say, oh, well, our application also needs to have access to this, and we can add or remove permissions as need be, things like that. Yep.
Okay, so on your side, it says the key one.
Uh-huh. That's fine.
That's fine, but when we make the variable name, we change it to SendGrid.
So the variable name needs to be that. It doesn't matter what you called it on SendGrid. That has no bearing whatsoever. You can call it anything on SendGrid. But what you want to call it is that in terms of the variable name, because that's what we're going to refer to in the code, is we're going to refer to the name of the variable. Okay. So the other steps that we need to do to set up SendGrid, that's the stuff that we kind of do outside of Visual Studio. And in fact, if you had Visual Studio open, this is the point where you'd need to reset it, because remember, anytime we change environment variables, that only affects when the application starts. So oftentimes the safest thing to do once you set or changed or work with environment variables is usually to reboot the machine. But in this case, all we really need to do is just restart the app that we're working with. So we're just going to restart Visual Studio if you had it open. In order to bring this in, there is a NuGet package called SendGrid. That's the one that we'll be installing once we get to using this. And here's kind of the code, the sample code that they give you to make it work. So let me zoom in on this and let's look at the code and how this fits together. So there's two namespaces we need to bring in, we need to import. So we need SendGrid and we need SendGrid helpers.mail. SendGrid contains a lot of those classes. SendGrid.mail contains like this email address class that we have down here. So we'll need both of those things. So the first thing we do as far as how this works out, we're going to grab that environment variable that we just set up. And you can see that's the same code that we had written previously. If you compare that with what we did for SMTP, we said environment.get an environment variable. We just said SMTP password or things like that. We just changed the name. We had a different name for the variable. Okay? So that's that. Next thing we need to do is create the client. So we're going to say new SendGrid client. We're going to pass it in the API key. So that's going to give it so that anything you do from that point will be based on that key. Okay? Next job is to just build up the email that we want to send. So if we want to build it completely in C#, this is how we would do that. So first we create an email address object. This one's for the from. The other one that we would create here is for the to. And you can see that it's got email address and then it's also got the name of the user. So this is being sent from example user with that email and it's being sent to that same user. Okay. So you put that in there. If you had, say, the full name of your users, you put that here versus you put their email there. Okay. Then we've got the subject line here, sending with SendGrid is fun, plain text and easy to do, yada yada. And you can see, so here's the plain text version, here's the HTML version. So we're actually building up both. So one that has tags in it, one that doesn't. Okay. Because the other thing to know, the big thing that makes these two things different, let's say I want to break things up into multiple lines. Well, in order to break things up in multiple lines with HTML, what do I use?
Break tag, or you could put them in
Right.
paragraphs.
So I do BR or P tags, right, to break that up. But those don't work in the plain text version. If I put that directly there, they'll see those characters. They'll see the tags. They'll see the actual HTML. They won't see that content. So what might I use with plain text to break things into a separate line?
You could use escape sequences.
So somebody tell me what escape sequence mean? You're kind of right, but what escape sequence? What escape sequence can I use to break this and say I want to have that on multiple lines? So on the HTML side, we've got BR. What's the equivalent to that? /n, right. In fact, as it works out, in order to put a break into email, you actually have to put 2 /n's. Otherwise, you don't get actually a line break. And part of that has to do with there's already line breaks in the way that it gets encoded and the way it gets sent. So if you put 2/ns, that'll break it down a line. So that's one of those things to know as you're building these things out. You'll need to use a BR in the HTML. You'll need to use 2/ns in the plain text. Does that make sense? Any questions there? Okay, so that's kind of how that starts out. Yep.
I don't know, are we supposed to bring all that code into the party invites?
We're going to do some, yes, we're going to do that in a minute. I want to go through this first, and then we'll look at, I want to look at the party invites in just a second. So that's how we kind of build up the variables, the structure, and then I'm going to say mail helper, that creates single email. There's actually a bunch of different emails, a bunch of different methods here on this mail helper. Each of those will give us something different. So for instance, this is just a basic one that we build the HTML. This is, it goes to one user. It's only got one person we're sending it to, and we're building the entire message in C#. So there's another version that we can use something called a template, and there's another version in there that we can send it to multiple people at once. So those kind of things we can do there. So we're going to say send it from to subject plain text. That's going to actually build up the message object, which we have here, and then we go send it. So send email async await. So this does support asynchronous kind of work, which is great because at least for my kind of playing around, the SMTP client really doesn't. So yes, so we looked at this, we kind of got started with looking at emails here. Yeah, a good place to jump to would be to look at the party invites. So if you want to go into, it should be your Unit 1 or Unit 2 folder, you're going to have the party invites project. If you would, let's open that up. And what I want to go through there is kind of look at it, improve it a little bit with the things that we now know. So let's start by just running it, because this has been a long time since we touched this. There's a lot of things we've learned since we built this application, right? So it'd be a good time to bring this forward and kind of update it, okay? So there's a few things going on. First and foremost, if you look at the views, let's say we look at the index view, one thing you'll notice right off the bat, what's up with this? What's up with party invites? Is there something unusual about this view? Yep.
We're including things such as the doc type, head, body, etc.
Okay. What does that mean? What is that telling you?
We don't have like a layout page.
We don't have a layout page. Right. So remember when we initially built this, we didn't have any sort of layout, right? So maybe the first thing we want to do before we go too far, well, one thing you might want to do if we were to kind of improve this, we might want to go to a layout page. I don't think it actually will matter for what we want to do today, so I'm going to just leave that part alone. But you can see that that's happening and keep that in mind, right? So if there's anything that we do with CSS, we do with JavaScript, just remember that you may have to do it to more than one page. So let's start with the RSVP form view first, and let's take a look at this. Okay. So if we look at what's here, let me open up that in the browser as well so we can kind of see what that looks like. So here we've got it. It is, as far as it's set up, it is using Bootstrap, so that's good. But we haven't set any autocomplete types on it, so it's not auto-suggesting anything there. So we might want to go through and do that real quick, just to make that easier to fill in the data. So if I start up at the top, right, so what's this first field? This first field is name, right? What is the user typing into that? Their name, specifically what?
Full name.
Probably their full name, right? So I want to set the autocomplete there to suggest your full name. Not just your first name, not just your last name, but to suggest your full name, okay? So I'm going to add in here, same place where we have the class. I'm going to say autocomplete is equal to what? What should I set that autocomplete type if it's the full name? Huh?
Off.
Off?
Oh.
What is the full name? You might have to look at last week's handout.
Is it just full name?
Given name?
So given name is just the first name.
I think, yeah.
It's just name. You're right, it is just name. Okay, so just name is the full name. Okay, I also want to set autocomplete. We've got email here. What type do I need for that?
Email.
Yep. Okay, next one I have is phone number. Right, what autocomplete type am I going to use there? Somebody else give me that one. What's that? What's that for? What's that field name that goes with phone numbers?
Is it tel?
It is tel. So TEL. All right, so we'll put those in there. That'll make sure that it suggests the right things to fill in there into the form. So that's where we want to start there. Okay. And I think that's really all I want to do on the front end for now. So if we test that, we should see it suggests me the right options to put in there. Okay. So, yep.
Supposed to do?
So it should be as you start going here, you see how it's suggesting? That's what you should be seeing. So it should be suggesting those properly. Now it doesn't look to me like it's suggesting the email address as it should be, because that's just previous ones I've entered into an email field. Notice that some of these are not emails, because it looks this way versus it looks differently. So I'm not sure that that's actually the right one.
Mine's working as intended.
That yours is working as intended for that one? I don't know why. Okay, I don't know why mine's not working then. But that is what it is. So that's how we're going to set those autocomplete types. I did want to go over that briefly because I kind of mentioned it last week, but we didn't really do an example with it. But that's all really you have to do is you look up the type and you add it in there. Let's go back to the home controller now. We can kind of see the logic that's there. So we've got the main index page. That's where we start. And we've got then the form. And we've got this submit page. So we got the get version of it and we've got the post version of it. Okay? So there's a few changes that we want to probably do as we're here. So the first thing I'd like to do is switch this over to use SendGrid. Okay, so we're going to use SendGrid to send email instead of what we have here right now. Okay, so I'm going to start that with, let's go ahead and just comment out everything that's in the try. I'm going to go ahead and keep the try because I still want, if there's an exception with sending it, I still want to get to this error page. So, but what I'm going to remove is what's in the try. I may just put this under another file so it's easier to see. Okay. So that's all that we should have left there. We still want to check whether or not the data that the user enters is valid, and we still want to try and show the user some sort of error message if something does go wrong. Okay, so now we want to bring in that SendGrid code. So first thing, kind of going back to our steps. So as far as setting this up, we've created an API key already, so that part's done. We've set it up that in environment variables, so both of those two steps are done. In fact, you won't need to do those steps again, assuming you're using the same API key for your other applications. But what we do need to do for this project is we need to go install that SendGrid package. Okay, so I'm going to go to the Solution Explorer. I'm going to right-click on the project here, and I'm going to say Manage NuGet Packages. Okay, and that's where I would then go in and install the SendGrid package. Now, just as a note, you will notice in here that there's this kind of console command, and you'll see this in a lot of tutorials that you look through, where it says package manager PM arrow install package SendGrid. So there is a way to install NuGet packages over the quote-unquote console. So the way I would do that, if that's the way you want to install the package, so I could do it here, or I could do it through the console. So I'm going to go to View, and if I can remember where this is, I think it's actually under Tools. Yeah, so if you go to Tools, you'll go down to NuGet Package Manager, and you'll click Package Manager Console. I just want to make sure you know where this is, because sometimes this is useful. Okay, so Package Manager Console, that'll give you a window like this. Okay, and what it actually is it's kind of a PowerShell console built into Visual Studio, and this allows you to do a lot of things. And especially, it's especially important if you're ever doing anything with any framework and you're using migrations. Specifically, all the stuff you do with migrations is through here. But we haven't been doing migrations this semester because we've been managing it through that SQL Server project instead. So if I go in here, I can simply paste that command. It's going to say install package SendGrid. Hit enter. And you can see it'll kind of go through here. So sometimes you may find code online that just says, oh, you want to install the package, here's the line of, here's the code that you need to run, say install package, yada yada. So that's how you get there, if you ever need that. That's how you get to the package manager console.
Mine is failing to install.
Yours is failing to install.
Yeah.
So let's look at the command that you typed in.
Well, I mean, it went through the right package, right? That's the.
It's not compatible with 451, I don't think. Yeah. So we need to uninstall it. So the thing that we need to do, because your project is on the wrong version of .NET, right-click on the project properties. We need to change this to 451. Why it didn't start that way, I don't know. Probably because you had an older version of Visual Studio.
Okay.
But you should be able to try to install it again and see if it goes through. Did everybody else did you get installed? No issue? Package install? Okay. Yeah, that's right. So what we want to now do, if you go back to the handout, you saw that block of code that I gave you. That's what we want to pick up. We're going to drop that into the try clause. note those usings, you'll obviously need to put them at the top of the file.
You're gonna make this async.
Yep, we do need to make this async. Okay, and then you'll need to add system threading tasks, import that, SendGrid, and that SendGrid helpers mail. Okay, now I would definitely recommend changing both the from and to. Change that to your own email address and see if you can, and then test it. Actually, this one, the to, change that to be where it's going to. So guest response is our model. So this would be guest response.email, and this would be guest response.name. And then this is where you put your own user. So test that out. And that should end up sending you an email to it should end up sending you an email to
Well, we still get the RSVP form error.
we still get which? Oh, right, because we're not returning a result. In the code that was there previously, the last thing we did was we said return view, thanks. So you still need that line at the end. It's giving you a suggestion for how to change the code, but other than that. Check spam. And did you put your own email address in there when you typed it in? Because you're saying whatever email you typed in. Right. So just use that. exact email twice, if it sees that, especially from a tool like this, it would register the second one as spam.
Not having a look here.
So what are you seeing? Let's complete code review. So, okay, so you go through your form. So make sure you hit execute on here to make sure you're running the latest schedule. Alright, so let's go back. Go through this. That's your right email address, that's the one you're logged into? Okay. And then, oh, you still haven't confirmed your account. See that top email from them?
I did. I didn't do it because on here I have to.
No, hit confirm email address. Cause you do have to go through that in order. Yeah, cause it was still listed on that. Now try to do it again. Cause I don't believe you can send an email until your account like that is confirmed.
That's weird.
Just look back through your emails on your head. Let's check it. See if you got the email. And maybe check your spam, because it might have gone to spam. I will say I have better luck with this going through my ranking email than I had with my Gmail. Just because spam filters on, well, there's no spam filter on a ranking email, where there is a good amount of spam protection on Gmail. So you might try that. It's just,
Is it an inside ranking.ed or it's just at ranking?
it's inside ranking.
EDUs.
So just by a show of hands, who has not gotten an email to go through yet? Okay, so we've got a few people. Okay, that's the right permission. And you try your ranking email?
Yeah, I'm doing that now.
Well, as far as what it got sent to, right? Because that's just a from email address. What matters is really where you're sending it to. It doesn't seem that the from really does anything.
What are the inside ranking emails? Just your first name, initial, last name. Inside ranking?
I think so.
Yeah, I think that inside ranking.org.
I have a hard time remembering because I have a different, mine's just PR Smith at Rankin EDU, so all the instructors have a different format for their emails than the students do. But you could try junk in here as well. Let's see. One possibility is that the API key, it might not be picking up. So just double check your environment variable. And make sure you restart Visual Studio.
I do have everything good then.
Because what you can do is you can put a breakpoint there on line 43 and see if it's actually getting that right API key. Because that sometimes can kind of give you an issue and it won't necessarily tell you that there's a problem, unfortunately. I would hope that that would give you an exception, but I think in my playing around with it, it did not. Yeah, your API key is not that expensive.
So it shouldn't restart.
Well, let's double check your spelling, so let's see. Unless some of those I's or L's, I don't know, because it's hard to tell on here with those. Make sure you hit OK on this as well. Otherwise it doesn't save it, so you may need to restart it each day and test it. Just one note, you may want to check if it's not going through. It may be that it's not picking up your API key. So one thing I would suggest, put a breakpoint in, check the API key is not null. If so, there's probably a problem with the way that your environment variable is set up. So 937 for you. Is it paused? Looks like it's going to be waiting on, is it waiting on there?
Yeah, my API is no. Oh wait.
You're on the wrong line. You have to wait till it executes that line. So go to the next line. Oh, no. Just hit refresh. What you want to do is step over. Because if you hit continue, that goes through all the way to the end of the program. So it's there. So if you want, by the way, breakpoint, you want to set closing. So it is there. So you don't have that problem. Okay. And check your junk in there to see if it. Okay. And you're sure you have the right keywords for something?
I'm pretty sure that my Linux got it.
Well, but this is where it's coming from. That's not where it's going to. That's coming from what the user types in, right? So let's go back and look at your RSVP forms and what you typed in there. If you hit yes or something like that, you can see it. So that's where it's sending it to. Okay. So just hit continue. So it says there wasn't any errors. One thing you might try, if you've got an API key, so yours is null. If you have an API key and it's still not working, I would recommend change the subject line and the body of the message, and specifically change it back to like what it was originally, because we'd originally been building that body in code. I'd recommend trying that and see if you get an error. So yours is coming in as null, right? So let's look at your environment variables real quick, just to make sure that you have the right type. So where did you add, where's the environment variable? It should be up there, right? It looks like it's not there. Oh, you see, you added it down here and you need to add it up there instead. So you need to just put it down at the bottom. So select it and delete it. There. Because those the environment variables on the bottom, that requires a full system review to apply those. It also means that any user on the computer can get access to those variables, not just you. So you want to make sure you put in your network section. It was SendGrid under underscore API underscore key. You check that with your code because you should have the same thing in your code. Did yours come through?
Yeah.
So now that I just do this, do I have to shut down Visual Studio?
Yeah, so, but before you do that, hit OK on here. And you hit OK again. Okay, that will save. So now you can shut down Visual Studio. Restart it. And I would put that breakpoint in again just to make sure that it's there now.
He's gonna change this maybe, the subject, or the.
Change the subject and the content to see if that
I
works.
don't know why it's not working.
Because it might have flagged it as being connected.
Yeah, same.
Okay. Still haven't gotten it to send, but it does pick up the API key.
Okay. Put the API with your breakpoint one line down. So it's after it's grabbed it. Yeah. Okay. Cool. So it is picking up the API key. And that's your Gmail. Have you tried sending it to your
Inside right hand.
no, leave that as is. So hit continue. And just let it go through. And now in the browser, go back and try putting your inside right hand email in there instead. Let's see if that makes any difference. Is this the email that you send off the account as?
This one?
What you have Dalton in there?
Yeah.
Did you confirm your email address? Because you should have gotten a confirmation email from them when you set it up.
Did you say?
So you can go through that. Oh, let's check your API key has the right permissions. So go back to your API keys.
Did you get your query?
Yeah, check your spam. If you go there.
Yeah. Did you do it with the right hand?
Yeah, do it with the Gmail.
It's got the right permissions, and you're not getting it to go through on either side. And that's where I don't know. So what I would do then, the next thing I would test, change the subject and these.
I tried that. Change them and resending it.
Yeah, change them to be the same thing that we had happened previously.
Still didn't.
All right, so I'm gonna go do something real quick on here. So we had some code that was already building up this email. So I'm gonna go ahead and put that back in, just so you guys have that. We had in there as the subject line was RSVP notification, and what we had as the body, bring that in. comment that out. Where's that? So guest response name is either attending or not attending. That's how what we had in there previously. So if I just change this to be body here, so I'm giving it the same text for HTML and plain text. If it isn't working for you yet, I would definitely try that either way.
I would just copy and paste it from the document like that.
Did you check that it's picking up your API key?
Yeah.
I don't know why it went through for you and not everybody else.
Is SendGrid like blocking the request since we're all trying to send it?
Maybe. And you're sending it to that address. Okay. So I would recommend trying changing the body and subject. Why is that showing up so small on my screen, by the way? I should make that bigger. There we go. Change the subject and body. So yeah, I'm not sure. Because that should be right here. Unless there's something up on their side.
Trying to put a breakpoint in, apologize.
Sure. Either way. Maybe you put it all the way down at the end and you're building up the message in the 57 or so. That's right. Because everything, you should be able to look at everything at that point. And we know the messages can be one of the questions when we're talking about the other pieces. So, body being inbuilt up there. And you sent that to the Gmail account as you did. So let's just see. One thing we could try, and I don't know if this is the case, but I know I did touch this briefly. If we go to the SendGrid website, if I go over to, where is it? If we go over to the marketing section and go under senders, this will kind of let you create a list of senders. So you might want to add the email that you're sending it from to that list. I don't know if this will fix the problem, but it might help. So if you click sender management, so I put from name would be your name, the name you're sending it from email address. Those kind of things would be the email address, the information that you're using as the from information. I don't know if that'll make any difference, but you could go through and try it and see if it does. I'm gonna just check this real quick to see if I get an email from the code that I have.
I just got an email that asked to verify the sender.
Oh, okay. Yeah, see, I did get mine going through, so the code that I have, the code that's up here is working.
Did you have senders verified?
I did have senders verified, so I don't know if that makes any difference. That's the only reason why I'm bringing it up, is because I do know that I have that already up and running, but I don't know if that actually makes any difference. But that at least eliminates it as being a bug in the code. One thing to check just briefly, because I know that you ran into this, Evan, and I want to make sure it's not an issue for anybody else. If you right click on the project, does anybody have this target framework here as something other than 472?
You right click on
The project, go to properties. Just double check that that is 472 for everybody. Okay. Jeremy. Okay. Alex.
Yeah, it's 472.
So if, because I know that that is required for SendGrid to work. For SendGrid does require it to be 472. If you have 471 there, it won't work, which might have happened if you had an older version of Visual Studio when we initially did this. Okay. I guess you're still verifying the senders.
I got the sender and it still won't.
Okay. And you're sending it from that. Oh, it's not verified yet. You see that?
No, just verified it.
Okay.
So just
And you're sending it from that Gmail. Okay. So I don't know necessarily why this isn't working. We maybe try it again tomorrow, see if we have some better luck. But let's just keep pushing forward. And again, if it's still not working, if we test it tomorrow, it's still not working. It may be just a case that there's something up on their server side. Who knows? but I want to kind of try to go in with the next piece. Okay. So what I'd like it to do, again, I can see that this isn't actually working for a few people. But what I'd like to do next is to kind of get it to send this email out the day before, right? So the day before the party, we want it to send out and tell everybody that signed up that, hey, the party's tomorrow, right? So in order to do that, however, I need some way of tracking who signed up, right? I need some way of tracking who's actually signed up. Right now, I'm actually not tracking that. Does that make sense? Right now, I don't actually have any track of who's RSVP'd for the party. So how could I go about that to make sure I have that information when I want to send out that notification? Where might I be able to store that data? Database. Good suggestion. So let's go ahead and add a database to this project because we haven't done that yet on this project. So I'm going to right-click Solution. We're going to add that database project. I'm going to call it partyinvites.database. So party invites database. I'm going to add those publish and table folders. So add new folder tables. And add new folder publish. You got that project created?
So I closed Chrome out and I tried to log back into SendGrid and it's saying my thing's invalid now.
Your what? Your password?
And my username and all that. It's crazy.
Well, I think you said your username can't be your email or something.
No, because it was. I just tried to do this. I had it saved.
No, I think it was something else because 89 initially was taken.
Right, and then it was strange because it's like weird because so I typed it in again and then it went through.
Okay. We'll worry about it right now. It may be that we just need to do password reset on it. There may be something going up on their side. But for now, let's work with the database stuff. So create a database project. We're going to call it party invites database. Remember, you need to right click on the solution. We already have a model here, which that's what we're going to build the table around. So we've already got this model called guest response, and effectively that's what we're going to turn into the table. Okay. So I'm going to add a new table here. Call it guest response. Okay, so looking at the model, okay, one thing that we see on this model, is there an issue here as far as turning this into a table?
There's no ID.
There's no T. Yeah, there's no ID. There's no primary key, right? So what should I do as far as the primary key is concerned? Huh?
Add one.
I could add one. I could add one. That's one option. Do I have another option?
Set the name as primary key.
So you're saying set the name as a primary key. Okay. What would be another option? far as primary keys here. I could do the email, right? So let's think about the upsides of those three options. So on the upsides and downsides. So I could do an ID column, I could do a name, I could do an email. All three of those could be, any one of those could be the primary key. Okay? So let's start with the name. Okay? What do I get by having the name as the primary key? Remember, there's a few things that a column being a primary key says. A column being a primary key means that it has to be not null, means that it has to be unique in the table, and it means that I can't edit it. Okay? So what are some implications then for the name that might be a problem?
It won't be unique. It might not necessarily be unique. You can have two people with the same name.
Right. In this particular application, it's likely to be unique, but it's not necessarily guaranteed. That could be a problem because maybe I want to invite two Mike Smiths. Well, then I can't because only one person can be in the database with the name Mike Smith. Okay? So that's one downside. It also could be a downside if for some reason it's a couple and they want to rename that RSVP. So that actually may be a thing that happens if we actually want to rename it. Okay, what happens if I put the email? Is there any upside? What's the advantages and disadvantages of that?
It's unique.
It
Only
is
one person
unique.
can have one email.
Yep.
That was what I was gonna say.
Yeah. Well, inherently we know, and as far as we care about who RSVP'd, really we care mostly about the email being unique. We really don't want necessarily two copies of the same email in our database, right? Because I don't need to send them an email twice, right? Whereas, let's look over on the ID side. Let's say I create an ID column and I make that the primary key. Now, all of those are not guaranteed to be unique, right? I could add a unique constraint for them if I wanted to force them to be unique, but I don't kind of get that out of the box. Does that make sense? So there's a lot of advantage in this particular case. Things like this make the email address just the primary key. Does that make sense? So I'm going to go down that road. So I'm going to take the email. I'm just going to move it up to the top as the first. That's not necessarily required, but what it does, it's just kind of convention, simply because we prefer to have our primary key usually as the first thing in the model. Again, it doesn't have to be, but that usually helps with readability if it is. Okay, so we're going to add that in, and now we can kind of go through and start building that model now that we've answered that question of what's going to be the primary key. Okay, so first thing I have is the email. I have the email. Say nvarchar 200, something like that. Not null primary key. And bring this over to the other screen so I can look at it. So I've got the email, I've got the name, and I've got a phone number. So note here that I have this as primary key, not primary key identity. Anybody know why? Why is that? Somebody give me an answer to why that is. Okay, I'm going to ask from somebody who didn't raise their hand. Brandon, why have I not included the word identity? Is what? You said default number? Again, can you, so you're saying that, okay, yeah. Essen, why might I not put why do I not want to put the word identity there?
Isn't it something like you said, like automatically generate or something like that?
Automatically, okay, so identity does automatically generate something, yes.
Yeah. I don't think you want the email of the person that
Right,
they put
so
in.
automatically generate. So coming back to you, Brandon, because you kind of had you're on the right track. So automatic, as Esten was saying, yes, it causes something to be automatically generated. Do you know what it causes to be automatically generated? Scott? All right, Alex, give me an answer.
Sorry, could you repeat the question?
So what is this automatically generating? What is identity automatically generating?
It automatically generates a number that is one greater than the previous one it created.
Right, but specifically it's a number, right? So you have to remember identity is always a number, right? So email address is not a number. Does that make sense? So simply because, so identity I only ever put if it's a numbered column, right? So I'm using this email address as a primary key. It's not generated from the database. It's something that the user's entering, and it's a string. It's not an integer. Does that make sense? So those are kind of the two reasons why I'm doing that, is because it's a string instead of an integer, and because I want the user to enter that, rather I want it to be automatically generated, right? If either of those two things, if those two things are true, right, where you want it to be automatically generated and it's a number, that's the only case where we really put the identity word in there.
So you don't do identity for a string, generally?
Huh?
You don't do the identity for a string?
It can't be identity. So in order for a column to be marked identity, it has to be a number. It has to be some sort of integer. That's a requirement. Okay. So we have that table set up. That's really all I need to add there. Do note there that I've let the phone number be null, but I've made the other three things required, right? So let's go ahead and publish that. So I'm going to right click on the project and say publish. I'm going to publish that to the party invites. I guess I'm going to call the database just party invites. And then we want to save that profile into that publish folder. So I'm going to hit save profile as. I'm going to go into publish and call it localhost.publish.xml. Okay.
Would you call it, or I'm sorry,
Localhost.publish.xml.
I
But
mean the database name.
it's party invites. Once you have that, generate script, you're going to then push that out. Generate script and run it. That should get that table there. because I mistyped the name there. So localhost. Okay. All right, so we have a database set up, and we have it deployed. We now need to integrate it, right? So what's our next step if we want to integrate it into our Party Invites project? What's that next step?
Like a DB context or.
Okay, so I want to go ahead and create a DB context. That's what we're saying is next?
You could make a model Party Invites database that will inherit the DB context class or DB
Okay,
set.
so you guys are saying the same thing, right? So you guys are saying the same
I
thing.
thought you
and
wanted more specificity.
Yeah,
so.
so you're saying the same thing. Let me just go through this because there's an important step that I have to do before that we haven't done. So let's say I go and say create new item, and we want to go to data. I want to say add that actually. That might automatically do it. The thing we want to remember to do before we can create the DB context, remember we still haven't added in entity framework. So I still need to add in that. There it goes, entity framework. So we can still need to install an entity framework before we can actually create that context.
Does SendGrid require us to, do we need network credentials to send the email? Is that why it wasn't working?
What do you mean network credentials?
Because we're sending from our email address at Gmail, we're sending from our email address, but how does SendGrid know that we're?
Yeah, so let me backtrack and because that's kind of an unrelated thing. So one thing to know as far as sending emails, and this goes regardless of what you're using to send an email, that from address is never really proven. It's easy. Pretty much every email provider out there allows you to spoof the from address.
Okay.
That's one thing that's kind of a downside of the current kind of way the email works, is you don't generally have to prove that you are the person it's coming from.
Okay.
Right? I can put whatever email address I want there, and most services will take that and send it through without you having to prove that you actually are that person.
Having some error over here.
So we've added that, we've added the entity framework package, now we can go create the context. So we'll let you go through that. That's okay, it doesn't exist yet. That's why test connection is giving you an error. It doesn't exist yet. That's fine, we're still
Yes, I can't figure this out.
because we haven't created that database yet.
Yeah, no,
I
that's
think
right. I think it's actually SendGrid. I think it's. Have you tried sending it with a different client?
Yeah.
And it didn't work.
Yeah.
Yeah, when you do that test connection, it's testing not just the
Like,
conventional.
Sorry, I've tried different keys, but.
You can try like.
I mean, you can write it. Yeah. But you can use
Then you can see if it was
use
the-
SendGrid and send it to SMTP too.
Yeah, no, it's not.
Well, like,
You could send it with like.
I was trying to.
There's like try C# first.
Oh, have you done it yet? Have you tried that?
And
Okay.
So now
just
add
to see if
in
the
the
actual
actual work on that Party Invites project. Yeah. So install the NGO package, and then we're going to create the.
You can try sending it with Perl.
Yep. Install that, and then create the DB context. Another thing you might need to do from just looking at NuGet packages, again, I didn't have to do this, so I don't know if it'll have any effect, but you will notice that some of these that installed with SendGrid are still already out of date, so you may want to go through and update those as well. But I don't know that that will help with the problem of sending emails or not. Although I do know one of these is the cryptographic algorithms, so that could have something to do with it. Yep. Yeah, let's take a break. Come back at 2:30.
Did you do empty code first model?
I would do empty, simply for the reason that if you don't do empty, you're going to replace the code that you already have in your model.
Yeah, I tried to mess with SendGrid again, and this thing is...
Yeah, there may be something going up on their side. I know that I saw a message earlier today that they were having some issues.
Yeah, I contacted her. I sent a few emails.
But I'm not sure what's down on their end.
Only thing that I'm mindful of picking, I'm not gonna worry, is that choose other inside of the developer. When I made my account.
Oh.
And it works just fine. Because I made it and then you were like, choose developer. I was like, no, I don't think that'll affect me, but it's usually works.
I mean, I know that the suggestion was you pick developer and then their suggestion is pick developer because what it says kind of on there is like, how are you going to use this? I have a hard time believing that.
The only way I can test it by making the
Yeah. I would try doing this. Go to,
So I'll show you, yeah.
forgot your password.
Because I know that because it's weird. Long story short, my last name is made up. So when I sign up for anything on Google, it is almost spelled out. So this is the one that is.
Check. So reset password. It might be using your own password set, actually. So you got it saved there.
You can try the other one.
That's the only thing. I would just try actually typing in the password that you just had changed it to, just to be sure.
The new
one. Yeah. Maybe for whatever reason it didn't save it. That's weird.
Here's the.
So there's something that's got to be happening on their side then.
Yeah.
I wouldn't, Scott, stop trying because it's probably going to ban your account if it hasn't already, which is maybe what has happened.
I was just trying the 3 that I had tried.
Yeah, but you've given it enough activity at this point, they might have actually permanently banned you already. In the system, so I would just leave it, and try it for a few hours.
Yeah, next time I'll just sign up with the ranking email too.
Yeah.
Instead of mine. I don't have a problem necessarily with the ranking one, but I can't use it on my phone.
Oh,
Like
yeah.
the phone app email.
Yeah, I'm sorry, that's just down to Outlook is not very mobile friendly.
Yeah, unless there was, I don't know if I remember right. If I thought I had it set up before on an older phone. I think it is possible.
Yeah, I can get into it, the interface doesn't work well. You can get into it just fine on the phone, it's just.
What time did you say that?
At 2:30. Yeah, I don't think that will.
Yeah.
I think more than likely is you somehow ended up being the first one to do it. That I think is more likely, because yours was the first one you went through, and then everybody else had just got stuck.
Yeah. And I need to edit off of the older email, emails from people and spoken on.
Yeah. So I don't know. Again, the code I have up front is working, so.
Because I use the same code as always, it's fine. It's definitely not your problem.
Yeah. So I'm gonna blame SendGrid on that one.
Yeah. Like,
Well, all right, we'll get it tomorrow. Maybe it'll work tomorrow.
Fizz Fuzz hanging out over here somewhere. This is the one that you made up along your first day of work, remember that?
Somewhere early in the process.
Yeah.
I completely forgot about it.
Yeah. I remember, I haven't done this one in a while, because it basically gets you down, okay, if it's a multiple of 3, else if it's a multiple of 5, else if it's a multiple of 3 and 5, and then at some point you have to break that pattern.
Right.
And
So if you built it as those cases, which is fine, that's actually how I built it when I was actually originally given these as an interview question.
yeah.
It's like, the trick is that that doesn't scale.
It doesn't scale, right.
So once you say I want 3, 5, 7, 9, 11, you end up with just exponentially growing number amount of code you have to write. So it doesn't work out. So there's a way to redo that.
Yeah.
And basically you have to use string concatenation is the trick in that. The magic trick in there is the string concatenation, and that allows you to simplify this.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay. So we added the entity framework project. We want to go and create that DB context. If you haven't created it yet, I would strongly advise you to create it as an empty model, simply because if you create it as from already having a database, it's going to overwrite what you have here. It's going to overwrite your guest response class. So it's gone through, it's already changed up there. So we're just gonna have to go back to what it used to be.
So you say don't use
I would not. I would recommend not. I would just say do it empty. Yeah.
So what you said, so we're not doing this entity data model?
Right.
Okay.
Yeah. Just tell it to create it empty. If you haven't, it's okay. We can recover from that. Don't worry about it. But this is a case where it's actually easier to maybe start it as empty. But that's debatably. So public virtual DB set. This is going to be guest response.
You deleted all the comments and
Yeah, I just deleted the comment. I think it looks like I called my table singular, not plural. So I called my table guest response, which is where I'm going to have this. So regardless of how you started, this is what we want to end up having in our database class. Yep.
Isn't it supposed to be guest response if they're guest? Our guests.
I'm calling it guest response because I called the table singular when I built it. Yes, normally I would put plural there, but I called the table singular when I made it, so that's where I'm going to use that. Or maybe I should just call that responses plural here, whichever way. But I called it singular. Okay. So that's all we should have in the DB context. Regardless of how you started it, that's what you want to end up as. Okay. Yeah.
Even if we didn't create it as empty, should we get rid of whatever they were created?
Yeah, if there's extra stuff in there, get rid of it.
Okay.
So this is all you want to have here. It's just the constructor and the DB set. Okay. I'm going to go over to the guest response now, and here's where we want to get this updated. So please make sure that all of your required fields and these validation constraints, please make sure they all have error messages on them. And do note that I've marked this as bool question mark. So if you generated it from the model, that will have switched it over to just bool. So you make sure all four of those have required. You want to make sure this is bool question mark. Yep.
I do have a regular expression and an error message too. Is that okay?
What do you mean regular
For
expression?
email?
Oh, yes, that's fine.
Yeah, underneath the flyer. Actually, I believe might not even be necessary.
Is that something you added?
It was here already.
Okay. Let's see. Yeah, that looks.
And this looks like it's redundant.
Oh, no. That's anytime you do a regular expression, you absolutely want to have an error message. That should just have the sign there. And that should be missing so much.
Yeah. I feel like that's something I might not have done.
I don't know. This is fine. Just leave it as is, because what you have here is correct. I'm not sure where it came from. We may have talked about it at some point.
Or like if I had like auto create, or maybe if, when I initially made party invites, I might have put something there.
I mean, we would have had to talk about it for it to be there. So. Okay. So that's what we have for the model. That should have that structured out. I don't think there's anything else here we need to add, but what that's going to let us do now, oh, we do need to set up one thing. But what that's going to let us do is save those responses to the database rather than just losing them. One thing I do need to do is I need to add my connection string because I haven't done that yet. So I'm going to go into web config. You may already have, oh, I already have one in here. And is that one right? Party invite database. No, it's not.
Is that the web config inside of the view, or?
No, yeah, you want to do the one in the root. If you use the one in the web, that one in the views, just leave that one alone. Those two are different, and the one in the views does a lot of kind of special things for that folder. The one I have in here is one that it automatically generated, so it's not actually right. Localhost, initial catalog is party invites. I believe that's what I called the database. Yeah, so make sure that your data source is localhost and that your initial catalog is party invites, because it probably won't be that if you create it as an empty project, an empty DB context.
What does the rest of the string look like?
The rest of that should be the same. Integrated security true, multiple active result sets true, app is equal to entity framework. But the two that matter the most is really just the data source and the initial catalog, because that says what server you're connecting to and what's the name of the database. Those are the two things that make the biggest difference.
Data source, local host, initial catalog,
Mm-hmm. Sorry. Yeah, I did call it plural. Okay. And just one thing to check, just to make sure that you have the same database name. If you go back and look at Management Studio, you should see the name there. So I've called it Party Invites there, just as a gut check.
Strings, integrated security equal true.
Yep.
And then multi-active result set.
Yeah. And app equals entity framework. Yeah. Yeah. Those are the. Yeah. So those are the ones that it has to work with. So.
Do you have a provider name? Is it system.data?
Yes, the provider name should be system.data.sql client. Whichever route you went through should have given you the right value there. Okay, so we've got a database hooked up. We want to actually save the responses, so I'm going to go to the controller. Goes all but this, and we just need to add that logic into here. Now, I have two options for sure. I could put the save before I send the email, or I could put the save after I send the email. Okay? So, just by a show of hands, who thinks I should should save it to the database before I send the email? Okay, and who thinks I should put it after? Okay. So, from the people who think after, why after?
Just because it fails when you're trying to send an email.
Okay, so in case it fails to send that email, I don't want to save it. Or sorry, I want to make sure that, what's that going to mean? So if it fails to send the email, that means it's not going to save it.
It would also mean that the user doesn't get any confirmation email from you to confirm that you're aware that they're going to be there, that they should go, like simple stuff like that.
Okay.
But at the same time, they also get that confirmation when they respond to the form initially, so I don't know.
Okay, so again, so if we say we put it after, I'm going to put it somewhere around here, maybe. And yeah, the real reason why you want to put it one place or the other is you got to think about either of these two things can fail, right? I could potentially fail to save it to the database. I can also potentially fail to send the email. right? It might not go through, right? So if I'm hinging one on the other, more than likely whatever I do first, hey, if that fails, the next thing is probably not going to happen, depending on. So if I have it in one try-catch like this, if this one thing fails, then the next thing won't happen. Does that make sense? So if, for instance, so there's two different ways it could fail, right? So we could fail to send the email, but save it to the database. Question?
My turn?
Yeah.
Are you recording?
I am recording.
I'll bother you later.
Okay. So if we save it, if we fail to send it, but we fail to send the email, but we do save it to the database, what does that mean as far as things are concerned?
Wait, what did you say again? I'm sorry.
If we fail to send the email, but we succeed at saving it to the database, okay, what are the ups and downs of that?
Well, I guess you still have that information on the person, but they didn't get any type of confirmation.
Right, but there's no confirmation that went out to either individual. Okay, so there's that. But I still have the data, right? Versus what's the other option? I failed to save it to the database, but I do send an email, right? What's the ups? What would be pluses and minuses of that? You got a hand up, Alex?
They get the user gets immediate feedback that it
Okay.
at least attempted to save the data.
At least attempted to save the data.
If your try fails when you're sending the email,
Mm-hmm.
and therefore the data is also not saved, you will not be able to send that reminder email that you were talking about because you will not have that data in your database.
Right.
But if you have
Right.
the save
Exactly.
word,
So if I send the email, then at that point it looks like it worked, but when it comes to be the day before and I want to send an email out to everybody, I don't actually have their data, right? So as far as I'm concerned, if it doesn't get saved to the database, it didn't happen, right? So which of those two cases is better? Is it more important that we send out an email, or is it more important that I save the data? Okay. Show by hands. Who thinks it's still more important that we send the email? Who thinks it's more important that we save the data? Okay. So whatever's more important is always the thing we want to do first, typically speaking. So that's what I'm actually would want to do first. I'm going to actually save it to the database first before I try to send the email out. Either way, I want to tell the user that there's a problem. So ideally, they can try it again. But I want to make sure that I don't send an email without saving that data. I'm actually going to put this in a separate try catch up here. So I need to add the database context. So up here, private party invite. Oh, I'm outside the class. I'm in the wrong place. Private party invite database underscore DB is equal to new party invite database. So create our connection to the database, just as we were familiar with. And then I'm going to return to here. So underscore DB dot guest responses dot add guest response, and then DB dot save changes. I'm actually going to, and I'm going to use that async version. Okay. Everybody got that down? Okay. So that's the part that I added. Okay. All good? All right. So let's go give this a try, and let's see, because there are some issues with this. Let's see if we can suss those out. So I'm going to go to an RSVP. I'm going to put in my name, my information, and say yes, I'll be there. Okay, so I'm going to hit submit. Okay, everything went through successfully, right? Saved to the database as well as sent the email out. Okay, in theory at least. What happens if I go back here and try to do it again? See, sorry we couldn't send the email or confirm your RSVP. An error occurred while updating entries. See enter exception for details. What went wrong on that second time through? Jeremy.
You tried to send the same email and it's already been accounted for as an ID.
So the email's fine. Sending out the email, sending out the email is okay.
I think what Jamie was trying to say is that you have the primary key is the email.
Yes, right. So the actual sending of the email is okay. It didn't actually get that far, but there wasn't an error with that. But yes, there is an error because I'm reusing the same email, which is a primary key, right? Remember, a primary key can't be duplicated. So there's already a row in the database for that, right? So this is not a very useful error message as far as the user is concerned, right? That doesn't tell them anything about what went wrong. So what can we do then instead to give the user some sort of useful feedback that email has already been RSVP'd? Or alternatively, what would be another option? But you had a hand up.
I was thinking we could do validation in the submit action.
So in here?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So check, what do you mean, what kind of validation?
So
Which you're on the right track.
Similar to what we did as an admin in the sports store, we can check the database using an AJAX to see if the email already exists.
Right. I could do AJAX if I want to give the user information immediately. If I don't want to give them user information immediately, I can still do it on the back end.
Right.
Right. So what I do want to tell the user, though, is I want to tell the user that, hey, this is what's up. Right. So if I simply wanted to tell the user that there's already somebody with that email, what's that first line of code that I need to write in here? What's the first thing I need to do that check?
Would you put an if statement and say if it contains it in the database?
Okay. It's not a bad place to go.
Wouldn't you first have to do like a first or default or a singular default to see if the email already exists?
I probably would. Thing is, you're right, Graham, in the sense that I could do that immediately in the if. So.
I'm trying to think. I think there's like a link method to return a true or false if that would be in the.
Which would be any.
Any.
Right. So I could use an any to say, is there anybody with that email address? Or I could use first or default and do that in the if statement. What I'm going to do though is I'm going to kind of go somewhere in between. I'm going to save it to a variable first. Reason being that gives us a little bit more flexibility for a different option of how to deal with the problem. So if I say var maybe what would be a good name for this? We'll call this DB entry because that's what we've called the other ones. So I'm going to say DB dot guest responses dot first or default x dot email. We'll move this down a line so it's readable. Equals guest response dot email. So effectively I'm saying go to the database and grab the row if it exists with that same email address. Okay. And again, if I just want to give the user an informational message to just say this is invalid, then any is really the most efficient way to do that. But what I would suggest is there's another option. So I can either tell the user that, hey, you can't reuse that email, or what's another option that I can take? I can say you're already registered. I can take that and maybe update the existing RSVP. Does that make sense? So what if their status may have changed, right? Maybe they RSVP'd a week ago and they said, yes, I can be there, but now they say I can't be there, right? So if instead of giving them an error message, I give them an opportunity to update that information, that makes it maybe a bit more useful. Does that make sense? So in this case, I'd argue that it's probably better that we update the information rather than we just say you can't enter new information. So if I grab the object, that lets me then do that. So I can say if we don't have that, if that entry doesn't exist, so if there isn't a row with that email address, then we're just going to add a new one, okay? If it does already exist there, that's where we want to go update it. So I might say db.entry. I'm going to say I don't need to update the email because we already know the email's the same. So db entry equals guest response name db entry dot phone is equal to guest response dot phone, and db entry dot will attend is equal to guest response dot will attend, and then save those changes.
So why don't you need the email?
Huh?
Why don't you need the email?
Because it hasn't changed. I know inherently it hasn't changed because I just compared it. Remember? So up here I just said, go find me the guest response that already has that same email.
Mm-hmm.
So changing the email would have no effect. Does that make sense? In fact, it might well give me an error because I can't change a primary key. So that's the reason I'm not going to do it, is because it is the primary key. That's the main reason. If it wasn't a primary key, then I might still do it, but because it is, I don't want to try and change it. Okay. So that will solve the problem of, hey, I RSVP as the same person twice. Let me just check that. Let's see that that works. So that their users aren't getting error messages on that. So I can say, yes, I will be there. It goes through, or I could go change it. No, I can't come, and it's still going to update that data in the database rather than giving me an error message, which in that case, I think for this particular application makes more sense. But that may not be the same way for every application that you write. So you just kind of have to think about what's the business that I'm working this for. Now, one thing to think here, if it does still fail, and I can test that here, so throw new exception. So say something else goes wrong. So I'm going to throw an exception here. Because something might have happened where, for instance, maybe the database is offline. So maybe I can't talk to it right now. That's going to give me an exception there. Okay. So the error page I have right now is this, right? What could I do to make this more friendly? Because in this case, I probably want the user to just try again, right? Maybe it's a sporadic thing, and if they try it again, it'll go away.
Add a model error.
Huh?
Add a model error.
Model error. Okay, so that sounds like a good thing. Where might I do that?
In the catch.
In the catch, right? So in the catch, let's say model state dot add model error. I'm going to write that as such. Okay. Is that enough? Is that enough to tell the user in a friendly way what's going on?
You need to change the view that's being returned.
Right, because if I still return the error view, it's still going to look like this, right? So what I want to do is I do want to return the, this is the RSVP form, RSVP form, and I want to make sure I'm returning that guest response object. Okay, so with those two lines of code, if anything goes wrong with the database, there's how it looks. What's missing?
Validation summary.
Right. Is that what you're going to say, Graham?
Oh, I'm sorry. My bad.
So we need to go back to the view. We didn't, at the time we wrote this, we didn't add that validation summary because we hadn't talked about it. So HTML dot validation summary. And false null. So if we add that in, that would look a little bit like this. You can kind of see the error showing up on top. I might actually be better in this particular view. You're kind of looking at it here. It is kind of awkward actually for it to be up here. So I'm actually going to move it down to the bottom. So I'm just going to take that code here. I'm actually going to move that underneath the submit button. Because I think in this case, that will actually look better. Okay. So we've moved that around, and part of that's just thinking about, you know, especially when you deal with emails here, you really have to think about, you have the database save that can fail, as well as you have the sending of the email can fail, right? So you have to really think of both of those in context. Now, another thing that we may want to do, we may actually still want to send the email even if the database save, even if it fails to save it to the database. Make sense? We may still want that to happen, right? So in that case, vice versa, if one side fails, we may still want to do the other. The way that we can approach that, say I remove the return here. Okay, let's go here. I'm going to do a similar thing here and add that to the model state instead. So whether it fails here or whether it fails with the sending of the email, we add that error. Okay. I'm going to take this thanks, instead of showing the thanks here just under that condition, I can say if model state if it's valid, then we're going to show the thanks view. Otherwise, we're going to show that RSVP form. So does that make sense? So that way we can try to do both, because each of them is in a try-catch block. But if one fails, then we still go on with the other. But the user only gets a confirmation if both of them didn't have an exception. Huh? So what I did here in this try catch, I commented out the return, and then I made this the same way. So I added the model state.add model error, commented out the return, added moved this down here. So the only place that you should have return in this function basically is those last two, minus the one at the top. that's this try catch up there, right? So we've got one try catch that's around saving it, and another try catch that's around sending the email. So in effect, that will let it try to do both things. This is also another case we kind of at some point had talked about, there's the wait keyword in here, it's telling it to kind of wait for something to get done. We could actually queue up both the database save and the email sending to happen at the same time, and then await them afterward. Yeah.
Well, how come you put 2 try blocks? Can't you just put the stuff in the first try block?
So remember when I have a try block, right? What happens when there's an exception? It stops at that exception and doesn't run anything else in the try block. Does that make sense? So if there was an exception in one line, right, of the saving, specifically, let's say save changes failed, then it wouldn't run the rest of the code, right? When you have an exception in a try, it goes immediately to the caption, skips the rest of the code, which is why I split it into 2, right? So if it fails to save it to the database, then it can still kind of continue to go try to send the email out.
I didn't get an error, but nothing saved in my database.
What error did you get?
I didn't get the error. It wasn't real.
But you said nothing's in your database.
Right.
Let's scroll down. It's because you have this line here. You didn't remove that line. So it still hit that line. That's what's up.
And then I don't know if it was something. Is this try catch message or something? Or am I just
That's what we nested.
That's what I thought.
The important thing is that they're
Separated. Yeah.
Yeah. So most of that setup should be reviewed. We've kind of looked at a lot of those things already. The part that we haven't talked about, what we can do now that we have data, right? Now that we have a way to get the data into the database, is we can talk about actually sending that email out at the time of our choosing. Okay. So the thing we want to get to next, where I have it open. Here. So there's a tool, there's another package out there called Fluent Scheduler. This isn't the only option out there as far as doing scheduling or scheduled things, scheduled tasks as we would call them. That's out there on NuGet. There are other ones. This one's the one that I've had the best luck with and seems to kind of the best supported. So that's the one we'll use. But the gist of this is, again, we want to be able to do things outside of just the user posting a form, right? We want to do things at a specific time of day. So in order to set this up, there's a few different things we need to do. The first step is basically install the package, and then we've got to set up 2 things. We've got to set up a registry, which is going to keep track of the jobs that we've queued up, but we also then need to build our custom jobs. Okay, so let's go through that first step and let's install the Fluent Scheduler. So right click on the project again, we're going to go back in here and we're going to look for that Fluent Scheduler. There it is. So Fluent Scheduler, that's the one I install. There we go. The term Fluent comes from the way that we're going to kind of configure the schedule. The syntax for creating it is very similar to that Fluent API that we've got for Entity Framework, but it basically involves calling a sequence of methods, and it's pretty close to English, which is nice as far as setting up the actual schedules. Now, in order to set up those schedules, we have to have something called a registry that keeps track of those schedules. And we're also going to have jobs. So the place I'm going to put these, I'm going to create a new folder called jobs in the project to put those things together. It doesn't have to be called that. It can technically be called anything you want it to be, but just trying to be descriptive about what it is. So I'm going to put that in the jobs folder. So, move this over here. Okay. So under the jobs folder, I need to create a class. I'm going to call this one job registry. So code, class, job registry.
You create a jobs folder
Yep, I created a jobs folder
in the database or?
in the C# project. So we're going to have a jobs folder, and then underneath there you're going to have a job registry class. Okay. So this class needs to be a subclass of registry. And specifically that's going to be Fluent Scheduler registry. So I'm going to bring in the import for that. So job registry is a subclass of registry.
In the jobs folder you just added the class?
Yep. We got a class, call it job registry.
So where did registry come from?
Registry came in from that Fluent Scheduler package that you should have just added. Make sure that you have that it is actually Fluent Scheduler, because there are other classes named registry in the framework, and if it's one of those, it won't work. So do make sure that it's Fluent Scheduler is the one that you're hooked up with. Okay. Gonna add a constructor, gonna call debug. So one common thing that happens once you start working with scheduled tasks and things like this is we need some way to log what has happened, so you can see it, because otherwise you're not going to know that your tasks or your jobs are even working. So one helpful thing to do in here is to just go ahead and put a line to log that the job registry has started, that we know. Okay. This class, this code here that I have in the constructor that's even been run. So this uses a class called debug here. If you remember from your first semester, you probably used a class that looked very similar, right? It was something.WriteLine. Does anybody remember what that was? Console.WriteLine. So console.WriteLine is okay and perfectly fine to use if you're writing a console program. If you're writing anything that's not a console program, such as a website or a GUI, you typically don't want to use console.WriteLine. You're not supposed to. So that's why we're using debug WriteLine. So debug WriteLine is the thing that we can use on a website, and this will actually end up once we go post this to the internet. So say we're running this on IIS, which is where we typically host ASP.NET websites. There's actually a log file. When this is running on production, we can actually go look at anything that we've written out to debug WriteLine. So we can actually go look at that log file and see this stuff, which is helpful. But we'll also be able to see this from Visual Studio as long as we have the debugger attached. Okay? So that's why that's there. Okay? We still haven't added any jobs to the actual registry yet. But before we do that, I want to make sure that our registry actually gets started. Because let's say I run it right now, you're going to see that this line never gets written. Okay? Because nothing's actually constructing this registry yet. Okay? So the way to get it to start is I need to go to Global ASX. And remember, this file we haven't touched too often, but the core purpose of this file is to have tasks that we want to start when the application starts, right? Which is where we've got this application start method. So anything we put in there will happen only once. It'll only happen once when the website starts running. So I'm going to put a line in there, and what we need to call is Job Manager. Again, this will be from that Fluent Scheduler package. So it's going to be import the Fluent Scheduler there. So we're going to say Job Manager dot initialize, and we're going to say new job registry. I also need to add an import for that party invites.jobs. So that's the line of code that we've added in there.
And that method for
Mm-hmm.
never mind.
So what that's going to do is take care of actually running the jobs when we want them to be run. Without that, nothing we do in a registry will have any effect. Yep.
Where are you at?
I'm in Global ASX.
ASX, okay.
Yep.
So I'm ending up with two tables in my database. One is called guest response and one is called guest responses.
Okay.
I don't know.
Probably means that one is, okay. So that, can you hold that thought? Because I know what that is and I know how to fix it, but I need to go to a different file to go fix it. So I want to fix what we're doing here first. So does that make sense? So Global ASX is anytime we want this to happen once and only once, that's where we put this logic. So that's going to set up the registry there. Okay. Another thing that we want to do while we're in here, which we hadn't done, I'm going to say database dot set initializer. And add system data entity, and this is going to be party invite. And that's just something we need to remember to put in here as well. That's going to help as we go, if we were to go forward and make more changes to the database schema. So those are the two lines that I'm adding in there. One interesting thing to note here, you'll notice that there's this route config here happening that's getting called. If we actually follow that down, I believe, notice that that's actually how this route config file gets initiated, right? Remember, we've changed this a few times, added in our own routes. That's where that gets called from. That gets called from this global ASX. Okay, so we've got that set up. Okay, so you had a question. You said you ended up with 2 tables. What happened there is we forgot to tell it the name of the table. So I just need to go back to the model class and say table guest response. Because again, my table, I created it as singular. So what happened for you is it ended up creating that table automatically from the model.
This is happening. This error. I'll run it and debug mode so you can see what the error is being called. But I'm pretty sure it's happening when I'm
Just I didn't yet see the error code.
here. It'll show up in the error codes. So it looks like it's happening. Yeah. I put a breakpoint in and it was going to when I called the singular default controller.
Could be a mismatch with the tables. So let's say we go here. So we're down here. It says C enter exception. So if we invalid column name. So on here, so you call it phone number here versus it's called.
Oh, it's because I didn't.
Right. You didn't follow exactly what I have on the phone. So if you change that over to phone,
So if I want to see enter exception, I just have to go to the I didn't
can just look at it and move the button.
So what do we need to do about that?
So just delete the other one.
So here I had to call guest response.
Yeah. Okay. So then you want to delete guest responses.
So we'll put a different name to guest responses.
That's okay.
So the
Yeah. You'll just need to create more data.
I'm assuming it's something in the database file.
Turning invites database.
Oh, invites.
So at some point there it created a singular version because you
Did a control period.
yeah, you have to be careful about the options you pick because it will automatically go create classes for you sometimes.
Oh, there it is.
So go delete that one. Because sometimes when it can't find it, it will suggest you want to just create it.
Right.
And yeah. So that'll happen.
Yeah,
You guys have
exactly.
pretty control period already?
Well, that was from before.
Okay, so we hooked up the registry. We want to now tell it to do some stuff on a schedule. Okay. So let's go back to job registry. Okay. And remember we have this log message in there. So let's check that real quick to just make sure that works. So if you run with the debugger, okay, and then you watch your output window down here, what you should see, there it is. You should see job registry started if you have it all working correctly. Okay. Does anybody so show of hands, who has job registry started? Who's seen that message?
Wait, how would I get that message to show?
So you need to make sure that you run with the debugger. You won't see these debug messages if you're not running with the debugger. So, but it'll be in the output window. Okay, so Scott, you want to hit run with debugger, and make sure you get this job registry started method. So, Essen, you have it?
So what am I looking for?
I was looking mine down
Huh?
I was saying, what am I looking for? So I ran debugger.
Ran debugger, look in the output window. You should have that job registry started method message. Remember, we put that in here. We're just trying to make sure that everything's hooked up correctly, right? Okay. Yeah. If you don't have that open, you may need to go to View and open Output here. Okay. Alex, did you get that?
Yeah, I did.
Dalton? Okay. All right. So we want to actually put some code in there. I'm going to hit stop. Okay. So the way that we schedule tasks to run is actually kind of nice. It's relatively simple. So we start with calling schedule, and then inside of schedule we can give it one of three things. We can give it a lambda, we can give it the name of a method, or we can give it a custom job class, okay? Which is really what we want to do is the third one. But I'm going to run through this with a lambda just because it's easiest to see it first. So if I say schedule, and I'm going to just put in a lambda, let me copy that from over here. So schedule lambda takes no arguments and calls debug write line now. Okay. So schedule says I want this to run at some point in time, and I want it to do this. Okay. So now I'm going to say to run now. Okay. There's a bunch of methods that we can call after schedule, and that's going to determine when it runs. So if I say schedule debug write line now, run now, so that's going to run it immediately and write up the word now. Simple as that. Okay. If I want to do something more interesting and maybe say run every hour, it would look something like this. So I'd say schedule write message hourly. Don't worry about copy and pasting all this stuff. It's actually on. Actually, I can just bring it over here. This is all on your handout. It's on, I think, page 3 or so, page 3 or 4. So if I say to run now, that is just going to run it once, run it immediately. I could say to run every hours. So that's going to tell it to run once every hour. I could say to run every seconds, and that will run every second. I want to run every minute, and I say run every minute. That make sense? So that's the kind of the basic structure. The two starting points. You either say I want it to run it now, or I want to run it later on this recurring schedule. Okay? That's the basic two options. You tell it how many and what the unit is. Okay? And you can see how this reads very easily, right? You can just look at it and read what the schedule is. Okay? We can also do a few things that are a little bit more fancy. So I can say run every day, but I can there add in the word, this method at, and that will tell it what time every day. So in this case, this is going to run it at 9:15 p.m. every day. Okay. Now one thing you should notice in here, this doesn't say 9, right? This says 21. Any guesses why that's 21 instead of 9?
It's a 24-hour clock.
Yes, exactly. So anything that's PM, just add 12. So 12 plus 9 is 21. If we want to do it in the morning, if it was 9 a.m., it would just be 9. Okay. So that's where you can say run it every day at that time. We can also do something similar and have it run every week. So, but to do that, we say run every week we use on we say on this day of the week, so this would be on Monday, and then we also specify a time. So this would be run every Monday at 2 p.m. Yep.
Time zone, is that?
So that time zone is going to be the time zone of your server. Does that make sense? It's going to be the time zone of wherever your server is. So if our server is here in St. Louis, it's going to be Central Time, right? Or if that server is in East Coast time, it's going to be East Coast time. You know, that's based on how your server is set up.
So it uses the server's internal clock.
Yeah, it uses the server's machine clock. So that's what that's going to be off of. So say we want to run, for this case, we probably want to run it once on a specific day, right? Or maybe party tomorrow. We'll just have it write something out. Okay, so we want to have this to run once on the day before the party. So we can say run once when. So to run one when, that takes a date time. So I'm going to say new date time. And then in that constructor, I can specify, here's one of these that takes, so the year, month, and the day, but I can also add in the time. So let's say we want to have it be today, because then we can test it. So we want to have it run today at, this would be 2019 is the first, we need to put the year in first, and then it's 11/6, and then I want to put the time in. So the time I'm going to put in hour, minute, second. So I want to put that close to now, right? So the current hour is 3 p.m., right? So that's going to be 15. So I'm going to say 15. I want to run it shortly. So it's 3:33 on my machine. So I'm going to say 3:35, 0. Does that make sense? So it should run exactly at that time and only ever that one time. So if you hit run on this, again, run it with the debugger, we see started. We should see when that time comes up. When that comes up as 3:35, you should see that message pop down. You should see party tomorrow. Mm-hmm. You have a question, Scott?
I don't know. I see job registry started.
Uh-huh.
And then,
So here's what we're scheduling.
right?
And then we're saying to run once at new date time.
Yeah.
So this specifies, we're building a date time there to say, I want it specifically to run once at that time, right? So I've got the year, the month, the day, and the hour, the minute, and the second.
Am I supposed to be looking for something in console?
Yeah, so in console 335, we should see something come up, right? Because that's when we told it to run. Does that make sense? I told it basically 2 minutes into the future. There it goes, right? So there it is now. Does that make sense? So we can set things up to run on some sort of schedule that way. And you can see that the actual scheduling, the way we define that, is actually very flexible, okay? Now, I probably want this to do something more fancy than just writing out something to the console, right? So for that, I want to build my own job. Essen, you had a question? Huh?
It is a job history or party tomorrow.
Okay. Did you make sure that you include the line here in your global ASX? If you miss that, then it won't have started it. Okay.
Would it be, now if you run it now, would it be too late?
It would yes, it would be too late. You have to bump the time up forward to be another time. Because again, it's only going to ever run it once. Okay. So what I want to do is build my own job. Okay. So the way I do that, there's a few things you need to kind of know to build your own job. But we'll kind of walk through that. If you look at the handout, there's kind of a template. So if you would, create a class in the jobs folder. You're going to call that one party reminder. Call it one party reminder and follow the pattern that you have here on the handout. And then we'll talk about the individual pieces. But again, call that party reminder is what I want you to call that class.
And then put like the iJob.
Yep. Party reminder, iJob. Follow everything that's in there. Yep. That's okay. Yep.
In the jobs folder, you created a class for?
Now you're going to call it party reminder.
Oh wait, I can get it.
There it is. See, there's the two messages. So you're good. So hit stop. So under jobs, you can create a new folder class called party reminder. And then follow what's on it's the page before that. Yeah. So follow that to build up this class. And then as soon as you have that typed in, we'll talk about what all those pieces are. because that's the constructor. Remember, constructors have the same name as the class. I think you just have a typo in it. There should be an N after that. Prior.
And then I job.
Shoot. Once you implement it, it's because you're still missing the execute method. This class does have a lot of boilerplate. I'm sorry about that. There's a lot of stuff that you just have to type or so where I've just kind of given you, here's the kind of structure of it. There's just a lot of pieces. So let's start from the top. So we've got the party reminder class, right? And it's, as you can see, it's implementing two interfaces, right? So we're implementing the iJob interface. We're also implementing the iRegistered object interface. That's the most important thing, right? That's where we start. That's the most important thing to make this work. Everything else flows from that. So first, let's look at the iJob interface. So the iJob interface is part of this Fluent Scheduler namespace, okay? So specifically, this interface is the one we need to implement anytime we want to make our own custom jobs. It's one the Fluent Scheduler provides. Okay. All it has is this execute method. So this execute method, that's where we're going to actually go typically do our work, right? Except that we've added a few things to this. So this is where you write your method to do your work. Okay. Now remember, this is part of Fluent Scheduler. Okay. The other one, the other method that we have, the other interface that we have here is not part of Fluent Scheduler. It's part of System Web Hosting, right? So if it's part of System Web Hosting, anybody have an idea of where this class came from? Given that?
Isn't it part of the C# library?
Part of the C# library. More specifically, what do you know about System Web? System Web is ASP.NET. So anything under System Web is part of ASP.NET. So this class, the iRegistered object class, interface, this is part of ASP.NET, right? So one of these classes is part of Fluent Scheduler. One of these is specific to ASP.NET as a whole, okay? And specifically, this is something that you'll need to know regardless of whether or not you're using Fluent Scheduler or some other scheduler. The thing to know, and the reason why we're going to implement this interface is typically is when we're working with .NET, remember there's this thing called garbage collection, right? When you're not using an object, it will throw it away, right? So registered object is part of telling it, I want you to keep this object around even though it looks like nobody's using it. Does that make sense? So the whole reason for this is because now that we're running things that aren't running when there's a user there, we need to tell ASP.NET to keep it alive even if there's not a user actively using our website. That makes sense? So that's part of why we have that. is to give the user, is to give ASP.NET a hint to keep it around. So anything we want to keep around long term has to implement the interface. That interface only has one method called stop. So remember, one of these methods is coming from the iJob, which is the execute, and the other method that we're getting here is stop, which is coming from the iRegistered object. Okay. So execute is where we do our work. Stop gets called when ASP.NET is shutting down. If it's getting rid of things and shutting down, it's going to call stop on our object to say, clean up now because I'm going away. So it gives you a chance to fix whatever you need to fix before it disappears. Okay. So what I'm doing in this class, let's look at a few things here. So let's start from the top. So we've got, that's what the interfaces are about. On the constructor side, first thing I'm doing is I'm saying hosting environment dot register object. Okay. Now register object takes an iRegister object. You can see it there. So that's part of why we have to implement that interface. If we want to be able to register it, we have to implement that interface. So I'm going to say register this object that's saying keep me around. I'm going to do some things. It may take some time, but don't get rid of me in the meantime. Right? Don't throw away this object. That's what that's about. So register it first. When we stop, when we get told, okay, we're going to shut down, we also need to tell it, unregister me. Okay, you can get rid of me. So that's how that works. Okay. The other thing we need to do, and which is where you can kind of see at the end of execute, we're going to say once we're done running, then we want to unregister. See that? So those lines all have to do with telling it to keep me around or not keep me around. If we don't tell it to unregister at the end here, then it would be kept around until the website shuts down, which might be some time, which means we're using up memory, right? So we want to make sure that that's there. Okay. Now here in execute, I kind of said that this is implementing the iJob interface. Execute is where we do our work, right? So I've got a try catch here, and the reason for that is if we let an exception, for whatever reason, if we let it get out of here uncaught, it's going to crash our website. So we absolutely need to make sure we catch any exception that might occur. Does that make sense? We don't want it to crash the website, so that's why that exists. Okay. So in try, that's where we're actually going to do our work, and you can see we're calling do work, and then we're waiting for it to be finished. The reason that I have to do it this way instead of using the await keyword is because this method's not asynchronous, and I can't make it asynchronous and still follow the interface. Does that make sense?
So that's what that wait keyword is for?
Huh?
That's what that wait keyword is for? Or
That's kind of what it does. Await kind of gets turned, await gets turned into those kind of lines of code. It says, go grab the task and then wait for it to finish, and then pull the result out. So that's instead of putting the await keyword there. Okay. Again, that's because this method here cannot be asynchronous, which is where I'm shoving everything into the do work method so that I can do asynchronous work. Because more than likely, especially if I'm sending emails or working with the database, I'm going to be able to want to do asynchronous work, not synchronous work. If I was just doing synchronous work, I could do it directly here. Okay. So we're catching the exception. If there is an exception, I'm just writing it to the log so that we know about it at least. And then note that this particular line, this is in the finally clause. Okay. So you haven't necessarily done a bunch with the finally clause. I'm sure you've had it mentioned at some point, but you probably haven't done a bunch with it. The finally clause is actually really, really important. Okay, so to just do a quick refresh on it, because I'm going to suspect most people don't remember it all that well. The finally clause always runs. That's the important part. Whatever happens, the finally clause runs. Okay? Whether something good, bad, it always runs. And it specifically always runs after any code in here. Okay? So if everything's good, there's no exceptions, we'll go try, finish try, and then we'll hit finally. Okay? If there's an exception in try, right, then we'll stop running try and we'll go to catch. Right? We'll go try, catch, and then finally. Right? If this runs and then there's an exception here, and sometimes you also get exceptions in your catch. This does happen. Say there's an exception here, and then there's also an exception here. Finally still runs. Okay. If I say I don't have a catch and I just have try and finally still runs. So whether or not there's an exception, whether or not there's an exception up here, finally will run. Does that make sense? So the whole point of the reason I'm putting it in finally is to guarantee that it happens regardless of whatever else goes wrong. Does that make sense? I want to make sure that this happens regardless of what happens above, regardless of what exceptions happen above. Yep.
So this job, or this party reminder job is called in the job registry?
Yes, so we'll call it from the job registry.
Okay, and by default, does it automatically go to this execute method?
Yes, yeah.
Okay.
By scheduling it, it will know to go to the execute method. Because remember, and so we'll look at this in a minute, but when we schedule something, it has to either be one of three things. It has to be a Lambda like we did, a function, or it has to implement this iJob interface. So if we're giving it something that implements the iJob interface, it knows that it has an execute method because that's part of the interface. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
That's why that interface exists, so that we know it's an object that has an execute method. Okay, so that's going to guarantee that this always runs, regardless of if there's exceptions. Now let's take that in comparison to maybe some other places of putting this code, because I just want to, again, stress why this fits in. Okay, so let's say I put it up here. Okay, ignore the finally. What case does this line of code not get run?
An exception occurs before it has a chance to.
Okay, so an exception occurs in one of those two lines, right? So if an exception occurs up there, it won't run. Okay, so next person. I'm going to move this around. Say I put it here. What case doesn't it run in?
There's an exception in the catch.
So if there's an exception in the catch, it won't run. Okay, somebody else. Where else wouldn't it run?
When no exception is thrown?
When no exception is thrown, right? So if no exception is thrown, or there's an exception down here, then it won't get run. Okay, well, so I could put it both places, and that will run in the try and the catch, but it won't run if there's an exception here.
It's never ending.
Have I solved all the problems and guaranteed you that that line of code will always run?
No.
Why not?
Because you'll run into the same problem again and again and
There's
again.
always the,
You'll-
there's always the possibility that the catch can have an exception.
Right.
Right, so if the catch had an exception here, this line of code would still not run. And if catch, that's true. There also is the case that things can be thrown, and this is not so much, this is not so much a case, there are also things that can be thrown which are not exceptions. Okay, so for instance, you can have errors thrown, and this is something I haven't run too much into in the C# world, but it does happen in the Java world. But you can have errors thrown that aren't exceptions. Okay, So an error would be like it's out, the system's out of memory, running out of memory, or other things. In that case, even having that catch, even if I didn't have any exceptions, this would still not run, potentially. Even if there was, if this was the only line of code here, that still might not run because there might be an error of some sort. Okay. Let's say instead of putting it in the finally clause, let's say I put it down here. Last thing I want to do in the method. What's the problem with that? I'm trying to get one more person that hasn't answered yet. Somebody from the other side. If I put it down here at the end of the method, what's a case where this might not get called? Where might it not get to this? Essen? So what could happen that this line of code wouldn't get called?
I guess if it doesn't execute properly.
What doesn't execute properly? You're right, but what doesn't execute properly?
The try or catch.
The try or catch. Okay. So yeah. So if the try doesn't run properly, it's going to run here.
Okay, yeah.
And then it'll get down here. But yes, if something fails in the catch, or if there's some sort of exception I'm not catching, for instance, let's say, again, it's not necessarily all exception, but if I just say null pointer exception, right, then null reference exception, then this is still not going to get run if I have an argument exception, right? So if I'm not catching that specific kind of exception, it won't run the catch. So that's where it's just really important to have that handy. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Maybe a little bit drawn out, but that's really, really important to understand as far as cleaning up after yourself. You need to make sure that things like that are in a finally. Yeah.
It's going to be kind of a stupid question, but what if you put that hosting environment as the first line of your try?
Well, let's think about that. At what point in time does that run? It runs before you've run any of the things that execute.
Oh, okay.
Right? It runs too early. I need it to happen last.
Okay.
Yeah, I was gonna say now.
I don't want to clean up after myself before I finish my work.
Okay.
Now's probably a good time for a break.
Yes, let me finish the last bit of this so we can just look at this, because we're mostly done here. So we look try catch finally. The only last thing here that I wanted to point out is now I've got this private async task. So this is an asynchronous method. This is that do work method. That's what I'm calling up here. Does that make sense? So now anything that I have that I want to do asynchronous can happen down here. That's where we're actually going to put the blood of the meat and bones of the actual task at hand. Nothing's going to actually happen in this part up here. This is just boilerplate. Anytime we want to build a job, we've got to add that part. Where actually work comes in is down here. Okay, any questions about that? Yep.
So if you scroll up,
Yep.
the stop, there's that immediate parameter.
Uh-huh.
What is that exactly doing?
So at least the documentation that I've read, stop typically gets called twice. The first time it gets called with false as being immediate, and that's to say, hey, you have a little bit of time, but please finish up. Versus if it's called with true, that's called a little bit later, and that's saying you have to stop now. Does that make sense? So the first time it's a kind, please stop, and then the second time it's you have to stop now. And that's what that's about. Okay, so let's go ahead and take a break, come back at 4:15. part.
Well, you had a screen up previously for this screen, but I don't know where that was.
We've just been looking at this file.
Yeah, right before.
Oh,
And then that kind of
might be.
confused me, because I was like, what the heck is that? And then,
So I right click on this,
Yeah.
and I said go to definition, and
Yeah.
there you can look at the interface.
okay.
Right, so like there's the iJob interface. You can see it's got, you can kind of see the the comment on the class,
Yeah.
got a single execute method.
Yeah, and I missed that, and then I was just
Yeah.
really confused. And I was like,
Or the register, you can just go to definition and see what's in that interface.
And you implemented all these track catches,
Mhm.
so I got my track catch.
Yeah. So the idea is this is where the work's actually happening.
Yeah.
Right. So the scheduler's gonna call execute, and then we're gonna say, okay, go do the work and wait till it's done.
Mm-hmm.
And then if there is a problem, then just log it. And then when you get all done, make sure we clean up after ourselves. Make sure we unregister this object so it can get
So it can get what?
garbage collected.
Meaning, like it's good, what
It
is
can be like thrown away,
Okay.
right? So like, and as long as we're using this object, it's in memory,
Yeah.
right? Once it gets garbage collected, that memory gets reclaimed so it can be used for something else.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
It's garbage.
Right.
So it goes to the garbage bin, and then other things can use that memory.
So no matter what this runs, it finally runs.
Yeah, that's what I was trying to get to. Is no matter what happens here, no matter what exceptions happen, whether they be in the try, or whether they be in the debug, or whether we even return up here, yada yada, finally always runs.
Oh, okay, and then you put, I believe it was this line of code, maybe, outside of the finally?
Yeah, I was saying what happens if we do that, right?
Yeah.
I was talking about why we want it in the finally.
Okay.
That's where we want it to look like.
So if it's outside of the